8 years. 8 years of silence, thick enough to drown in. It had been that long since I'd last sat at the polished oak table in my parents' home, passing dishes of overcooked turkey and overly sweet pie while pretending not to notice the pointed questions, the condescending smiles, the way my name was always said last, if at all. I used to think if I were just a little more helpful, a little quieter, a little more forgiving, they might see me. But invisibility became my inheritance, handed down between overfilled plates and half-hearted hugs. Then the exclusion came. Not with a scream or a slammed door, but with a silence more brutal than any blow. Every year, the gathering was a tradition, an unspoken ritual of judgment and display. When I was younger, I would spend days baking desserts from scratch, ironing linens, arranging centerpieces with care, hoping someone might notice. I gave so much of myself to those weekends. But the year I stopped being convenient, I stopped being invited. I learned from a cousin's Instagram story that the invitations had gone out. A scenic photo of a lakeside lodge. My parents, beaming. My sister and her fiancé, arms entwined. The caption read, "And so the tradition continues." My name wasn't even mentioned. I stared at that photo for a long time. Not with anger. Anger had burned itself out years ago, but with a quiet understanding. They had made their choice. And so I made mine. In the years since, I built a life. Brick by brick, I laid down the foundation of something they never expected. I started my own business, modest at first, from my cramped one-bedroom apartment where the walls leaked and the neighbors played music too loud on weeknights. But I had vision. And stubbornness. And something they never gave me, belief in myself. The years passed, and the business grew. Clients trusted me. Employees respected me. I bought a little house on a quiet street with magnolia trees that bloomed like soft white fire every spring. I painted the walls myself, picked out second-hand furniture that I restored with my own hands, and learned the rhythms of peace. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. And then they came. It was a Wednesday in late September when the knock echoed through my hall. I wasn't expecting anyone. I set down my tea, still steeping, and walked to the door, already dreading a salesman or another misplaced delivery. But when I pulled it open, time stopped. There they were. All of them. My mother, still in her pearls and pressed blouse. My father, hands shoved in his pockets like he was doing me a favor just by standing there. My sister, clutching her designer purse like it might shield her from discomfort. And behind them, uncles, aunts, cousins. The whole symphony of judgment and polite cruelty I had worked so hard to escape. I said nothing. For a moment, they stood frozen. My mother's painted smile wavered. My father blinked. My sister's mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no sound came. Because in that moment, they saw it. The woman who had always stood behind them was now standing in front. In her own doorway. In her own power. All smiles disappeared. And it was only the beginning. They didn't know I had watched them approach from the kitchen window. I saw the rental car pull up, overstuffed with people dressed in autumn hues and forced expectations. They moved like a group that hadn't rehearsed their lines, uncertain who should speak first or if the lines were still theirs to deliver. I recognized the choreography. Growing up, every family event was theater. My mother the director, my father the financier, and the rest of us mere actors on a gilded stage. I played my part dutifully, the helper, the quiet one, the shadow to my sister's spotlight. I never ad-libbed. I knew better. But the play ended 8 years ago. And no one told them I had left the stage. Now, standing in my doorway, I watched the confusion bloom in their eyes. My home didn't match their memory of me. They had boxed me in years ago, fragile, forgettable, forever the supporting character. They hadn't expected the ivy-wrapped porch, the welcoming scent of lemon balm drifting from planters I'd grown myself, or the soft warmth of light filtering through sheer gold curtains. They hadn't expected success that looked nothing like theirs, quiet, sturdy, and entirely self-made. My mother was the first to recover. "Darling," she said, stepping forward like this was normal, like she hadn't erased me from family photos with nothing but neglect. We were, in the area. Thought we'd stop by. I let her words settle in the air between us. I didn't respond. Silence, I had learned, is a powerful kind of honesty. My father cleared his throat. Your sister said you moved. This is quite a place. His voice cracked on the compliment. He had expected something less. Less space, less beauty, less dignity. But he didn't know that I had learned how to turn neglect into design, how to craft a sanctuary from the broken pieces they left behind. Is this really your house? Asked my cousin Graham, his tone slipping somewhere between surprise and skepticism. Yes, I smiled, small, steady. And I own it outright. That landed with a soft thud. The silence that followed was rich with unspoken things. Their eyes flicked to one another. No one congratulated me. Of course they didn't. That would require acknowledgement of the years they pretended I didn't exist, of the fact that I had done something they hadn't expected. Something that didn't need their approval. Can we come in? My sister asked finally, her voice brittle. It's been a long drive. I should have said no. I had dreamed of that moment, fantasized about turning them away as they had once turned their backs on me. But something in me, a remnant of that younger girl who still longed to be seen, stepped aside. Sure, I said. Just don't touch anything. They filed in like tourists unsure of sacred ground. My living room was soft and elegant, layered with textures that spoke of care, not cost. My fireplace flickered with a gentle amber flame. A book rested on the coffee table, Margaret Atwood, I think. I'd been halfway through rereading The Handmaid's Tale when the knock came. They sat stiffly. No one knew what to say. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was supposed to be small, struggling, grateful for their sudden return. Instead, they looked like children at a stranger's table. And I had never felt taller. They sat on the edge of my furniture like it might collapse under their weight, unsure of how to blend into a space that didn't belong to them. My sister crossed her legs and uncrossed them. My mother straightened a non-existent wrinkle in her coat. My father studied the ceiling beams like he was appraising the wood. No one asked the question they really wanted to. How? How had the forgotten one, the invisible daughter, the quiet niece, built this? They wouldn't dare ask. To ask would be to admit they never really knew me. That their version of me, helpless, directionless, had been a myth of their own making. I let the silence stretch. It didn't bother me. I had learned to live inside it. Years ago, silence was the sound of isolation. Now it was the sound of control. I poured myself tea from the pot I'd steeped earlier. Jasmine and honey. The scent filled the room like a gentle rebellion. No one asked for a cup. No one was offered. My cousin Clara finally broke the quiet. We just thought maybe, she trailed off, fiddling with the hem of her blouse. Maybe it was time. You know, to reconnect. I raised an eyebrow. Reconnect. My voice was level, but I saw the ripple it caused. My mother shifted in her seat. My sister looked away. I didn't even know you'd moved, my father said, a poor attempt at deflection. You didn't tell anyone. Why would I? I replied. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. A verdict on the years they had chosen absence. The birthdays missed. The calls unreturned. The holidays where my chair sat conspicuously empty and no one thought to ask why. I had learned then that love is not always loud, but absence? Absence can be deafening. I found out from Graham, my sister offered, as if that explained everything. He saw your name on a deed record. He was curious. Of course. Not proud. Not supportive. Just curious. I nodded slowly. The house was a foreclosure. It needed work. I fixed it up. That was the closest I would come to explaining. They didn't deserve the full story, the years of grit, the late nights, the scraped knuckles and solitary meals on the floor before I had furniture. They hadn't earned the right to my narrative. My mother finally met my eyes. We didn't mean to hurt you, she said, her voice the softest it had been in years. I didn't flinch. You just did, I said, setting my teacup down. The air thickened. Because that was the truth. They hadn't meant to. But the damage didn't care about intentions. The wounds they left weren't dramatic. They were quiet. Paper cuts of indifference. 1,000 tiny dismissals. Death by 1,000 omissions. So, what are you doing now? Asked my Uncle Paul, attempting cheer. Work-wise. There it was, the unspoken need to measure me, to assign me value based on profession, income, prestige. I run a business, I replied simply. Property consulting and design. He nodded, unsure what to say. It didn't fit into the neat boxes they used to label people. Doctor, lawyer, failure. My father cleared his throat. So you're not married? The shift was almost laughable. From dismissive to interrogative, as though this house, this life, needed a reason beyond myself. No, I said. And I didn't need to be to build this. My mother blinked. They couldn't understand. I hadn't built this out of bitterness. I'd built it out of truth. The kind that blooms in solitude. The kind that grows when no one is watching, when you've stopped waiting for permission to begin. And as I looked around the room filled with people who had never truly seen me, I realized something. They had come looking for the version of me they left behind. But she was gone. And I had no intention of resurrecting her. What they never understood, what they still didn't, was what they took from me. It wasn't just the absence of invitations, or the way they spoke over me like I was furniture with ears. It wasn't just the birthdays forgotten, the accidental group messages that somehow always missed my name, or the family photos where I was positioned at the very edge, like an afterthought they weren't sure how to crop in. No, what they took was gentler. And crueler. They took the version of me that once hoped. The girl who once stood in front of the mirror rehearsing conversations, imagining her mother would one day ask her how her heart was, not how her resume read. The one who used to press freshly baked scones into her sister's hands, just to see her smile. They never returned that girl. And in her place, I built someone else. They thought that girl had just drifted. Lost herself. They told stories about how quiet I'd become, how I was always a bit of a loner, as if the silence hadn't been something they'd stitched into me thread by thread. I listened as my uncle asked again about my work, as if my earlier answer hadn't counted. So, do you have an office, or is it one of those work-from-home things? I let the corner of my mouth lift. Both. I have a home office and a commercial space across town. We handle everything from real estate strategy to interior design implementation. He blinked, and I saw it, the flicker of something like respect, carefully masked behind a sip of water. What's the name of the company? My cousin asked. Olive and Sage. It wasn't just a name. It was a reclaiming. A nod to the girl who once grew herbs in windowsills and dreamed of warm, beautiful places that felt like sanctuary. Olive for peace. Sage for wisdom. Two things I had grown in abundance, though not without cost. They didn't know that I'd spent the first winter in this house without central heating, wrapped in layers and lighting candles for warmth. They didn't know how many times I had fixed things with YouTube tutorials, scraped knees, and borrowed tools. They didn't know about the clients I courted with trembling confidence or the nights I cried from the weight of holding it all alone. They didn't ask. Not then. Not now. Instead, my sister, sweet, curated, golden-haired as ever, sighed and said, "Well, it's good you found something that works for you." Like it was a phase. Like I hadn't bled to build it. I stood up then, slowly. The room went still. There was nothing abrupt in my movement, but it shifted the atmosphere. Would anyone like a tour? I asked, not out of courtesy, but to watch them squirm. My mother nodded too quickly. Yes, of course. We'd love to see what you've done. So I led them through. Room by room, I showed them the life they had no part in creating. The reading nook with the velvet chaise lounge and antique lamp I restored myself. The guest room with linens folded just so, for friends who'd stayed here in moments of need. The tiny art studio, sunlight pouring in from the skylight, walls pinned with sketches and drafts. My life's quiet heartbeat, Each corner was deliberate. Every shelf told a story they'd never bothered to read. By the time we returned to the living room, my father was uncharacteristically silent. My mother wore a mask of polite admiration. "You've really made something of yourself," she said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a reckoning. I met her gaze. "Yes, I have." And in that moment, I realized something even more profound. What they took from me had made space for something better. They took approval. I found self-worth. They took presence. I built peace. They took inclusion. I made a home they didn't recognize. And perhaps never would. After the tour, they settled back into their seats, noticeably quieter. My sister kept fiddling with the hem of her blouse. My father rubbed the bridge of his nose like he had a headache he couldn't explain. My mother's smile was strained now, the kind that trembles at the edges when control begins to slip. It wasn't supposed to be this way. They had come here expecting what? That I'd be living in squalor? That I'd burst into tears at their surprise visit, invite them into a shabby living room with mismatched chairs and a dusty television set, eager for scraps of their attention? They had built a narrative in my absence, and I had quietly dismantled it brick by brick, with every room they walked through, every carefully placed photograph, every art piece that bore my signature or the name of my business. I could feel it happening, their old confidence faltering, their assumptions unraveling under the weight of evidence they couldn't dismiss. "So, you did all this alone?" my cousin Clara asked finally, the question hanging between awe and disbelief. "Yes." I didn't elaborate. I owed them no tour through my scars. My sister looked down at her hands. "It's just, you didn't post much. Online, I mean." "We didn't know." I tilted my head. "You never asked." A ripple moved through the room. Truth is funny that way, quiet but seismic. It makes people uncomfortable. They'd rather swim in suggestion than stand in its undertow. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked older than I remembered, though maybe it was just the lighting or the weight of unspoken guilt pressing into her bones. "We were going to invite you," my father began, "to the gathering this year." I smiled slowly. "But you didn't." He looked at me, mouth agape, words sputtering behind a wall of pride. My mother picked up where he left off. "We thought, well, after last time, maybe you needed space." I could have laughed. Space? They hadn't given me space. They'd given me absence. Abandonment dressed in the language of self-care. "You didn't think I'd want to come," I said, not as an accusation, but a statement of truth. "You didn't think I mattered." Silence again. In that stillness, I looked at them, really looked. My sister's perfect manicure, my mother's expensive scarf, the new watch on my father's wrist. They still lived in the world where presentation was everything, where you cut off what didn't fit the image, even if it bled. I had been their cut, and now they were trying to pretend the scar didn't show. I let the silence stretch. "I made pecan pie," I said after a moment, my voice soft. "Same recipe I used to bring to the gatherings." My mother blinked. "Oh!" "It's in the kitchen." But I only made one. I let that sit. And I didn't plan on company. My sister stood up then, too quickly, her voice tight. "We didn't come to cause trouble. We thought maybe you'd be happy to see us." I looked at her, at the girl who once told me I was being too sensitive when I cried after being mocked at dinner. Who took the side of silence when I needed a voice. "Did you ever stop to wonder," I said, "what it felt like not to be missed?" She looked away. They all did. Because the truth was, they hadn't missed me. Not until my absence made them uncomfortable. Not until they stumbled upon evidence that I had done just fine without them. That I had become more than the forgotten one. That I had flourished. And now they didn't know what to do with that. The mask was slipping. And they were beginning to realize. They were not the ones in control of this narrative anymore. The kitchen held more ghosts than any room in the house. Not because it was haunted by the dead, but because it remembered. It remembered the girl who once stood at the counter, hands raw from scrubbing dishes, trying to earn her place. The girl who brought her famous pecan pie to every family event, only to watch it sit untouched while store-bought cheesecakes were praised as divine. It remembered how I used to carry my worth in that crust, those carefully layered pecans, the drizzle of bourbon I learned from my grandmother before she forgot my name, and then forgot everything else too. So when I brought the pie to the table, there was no ceremony. No plates. No forks. Just the silence of eyes that knew what it meant and couldn't name it. "Smells incredible," my cousin Graham said, breaking the tension with his practiced cheer. He always had the social graces, the ability to float above discomfort like it didn't touch him. But even he avoided my eyes when he reached for a napkin, hesitated, then withdrew his hand. "I'm not hungry," my sister murmured. "We should probably get going." My mother's lips parted slightly, as if to protest, but she said nothing. My father looked down at his shoes. I moved to the windows, opening one slightly to let in the afternoon breeze. The scent of lemon balm drifted in, fresh and familiar. It grounded me. "I spent a lot of years wishing you'd walk through that door," I said quietly, my back to them. No one responded. I imagined what I'd say. "I thought maybe if you came back, I'd feel like it all made sense, that the ache would stop." Still, no one spoke. I turned around slowly, the afternoon light catching on the amber glass pendant above the table. "But now that you're here, I realize something." They watched me, wary, bracing for anger. But anger had left me long ago. What remained was deeper. More dangerous, perhaps, to people like them. Peace. "I didn't need you to come back," I said. "I needed me to stop waiting." My sister's mouth trembled. She wasn't used to hearing me speak this way. I used to defer, to fold myself into whatever space they gave me. But now? I had built the space myself. "We're family," my mother finally whispered. "That has to mean something." I nodded. "It does. It means I learned exactly how not to treat people." My father flinched. Not visibly, but enough. A muscle in his jaw. A flicker in his gaze. The kitchen clock ticked on. "We should go," my sister said again, more firmly. "Yes," I agreed. "You should." They rose slowly. No one reached for the pie. I didn't walk them to the door. I stood by the window, watching them fumble with keys, murmuring among themselves, trying to make sense of a home that had no room left for the version of them they'd brought. When the car pulled away, I didn't cry. Instead, I plated a slice of that pie, carried it to the back porch, and sat beneath the arch of jasmine I planted my first spring here. It was warm. It was sweet. It tasted like something earned. And the silence? It wasn't loneliness anymore. It was freedom. After they left, I went to the drawer in my study. The one I never opened unless I needed to remember. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Some written in anger, some in sorrow. None mailed. They were my quiet rebellions. My unsent confessions. A record of all the times I wanted to scream, "Why don't you see me?" But only had a pen. The oldest was dated 8 years ago, the day after the last family gathering I attended. I remember sitting on the floor of my tiny apartment, knees pulled to my chest, writing by candlelight because the power had gone out and I couldn't afford the bill until payday. It started with, "Dear Mom, I'm sorry I brought the wrong wine." I didn't realize there were rules now. I didn't know that not wearing designer shoes meant I didn't belong at your table. I had cried when I wrote it, blotting the page with tears, pressing the pen too hard. Another was addressed to my sister. "You told everyone I was going through something, as if that explained my absence. But the truth is, I stopped coming because I couldn't watch you pretend I was okay when you never asked." I'd written one to each of them at some point. Even my cousin Clara, the only one who occasionally texted, though her concern was always followed by gossip. And then there were the ones to no one in particular. Just names scrawled at the top, to the ones who watched me disappear, to the empty chair at every holiday, to the version of me that begged to belong. I didn't need to read them now. I knew them by heart. But I held one between my fingers, unfolding the creases like I was smoothing out old grief. It was the last one I'd written, just 6 months ago. It said, If you ever come back, know this. I don't want apologies wrapped in small talk. I don't need explanations that protect your pride. I want honesty. Not the convenient kind. The kind that costs something. They hadn't brought that. I returned the letter to the drawer, closing it with care. The visit had stirred up old shadows, but it hadn't undone me. That was the difference now. I could face them without shrinking. I could let them in and out without losing myself. The house felt still again. Not empty. Just mine. I made tea, sat by the fire, opened the book I'd abandoned when they knocked. The pages were a balm, the words familiar. But my thoughts drifted, not to the past, for once, but to the future. What came next? I had spent years surviving, building, healing, but what did thriving look like? The thought wasn't frightening. It was electric. The kind of question that invited possibility. I set the book down and picked up my journal instead. On the first clean page, I wrote, Chapter 1, The After, because survival had been the prologue. And the story? The real story was only just beginning. If they'd asked me, really asked, I might have told them. I might have told them how many nights I fell asleep whispering prayers into my pillow, not to be rich, not to be loved, just to be seen. I might have told them about the first client who believed in me, about how I cried in the car after that meeting, not because I was happy, but because someone had listened to my ideas without cutting me off. I might have told them about the night the pipes burst in this house, how I stood ankle-deep in freezing water, wrench in hand, learning from my phone screen how to shut off the main valve. No one to call, no one to blame. Just me, a soaked sweater, and the sound of my own resilience. But they didn't ask. They came with their own stories, assuming they knew how mine must have gone. I used to ache for their curiosity. Now I guard my truth like gold, precious not because it is rare, but because it is finally mine. There's power in what we don't say. There's clarity in what we withhold, not out of spite, but out of sovereignty. They had heard about me, sure. Through gossip, through second-hand conversations. I'd become folklore, the one who left. The quiet one, the one with the business, right? Half memory, half myth. But I was real. I had a life built not from hand-me-downs or inherited favor, but from nights spent sweating over spreadsheets, painting walls at 2 a.m., and learning to trust my own instincts over anyone else's opinions. That kind of life doesn't demand acknowledgement. It becomes its own validation. I think that's what unsettled them most. Not just the home, or the business, or the fact that I hadn't fallen apart without them, but that I had grown into someone who didn't need their permission to be whole. They thought I'd be angry. Instead, I was at peace. They thought I'd beg for inclusion. Instead, I offered them tea they didn't deserve, and silence they didn't know how to sit inside. They thought this was about revenge. But it never was. I didn't want to punish them. I just wanted to be free. And I end the early years, I kept things scraps of my worth, tucked away like evidence. Photos of the events I hosted that no one in my family attended. Thank you cards from clients. The first check I framed not because it was large, but because it was mine. They were my proof of life. When I had no witnesses, I became my own. When they withheld validation, I documented every milestone to remind myself I wasn't invisible. A drawer full of paper and pride. Some nights I'd open that drawer just to touch the pages, as if feeling the ink would tether me to something solid. I once brought one of those cards, a handwritten note from a bride I helped through a last-minute venue crisis, to a family dinner. I don't know what I expected. Maybe a nod. Maybe just a well done. But I never pulled it out. Because halfway through the meal, my sister announced her promotion, and the table exploded in applause. There was no room left for my small victories. So I learned to keep them, to celebrate them in private, to pour a glass of wine in my kitchen and raise it to the ceiling as if the plaster would toast me back. And over time, the drawer became less important. Not because the proof mattered less, but because I needed it less. The woman I am now doesn't archive her worth. She doesn't beg the unseeing to see. But that drawer? I never emptied it. Because sometimes, when the shadows creep in or when ghosts from the past show up uninvited and expect you to make room, you need to remember the girl who kept going even when no one clapped. She deserves to be remembered. She built this. And I'll never forget her. After they left, I didn't clean. I let their fingerprints rest on the rim of the untouched glasses. I left the indentation in the cushion where my sister sat, fidgeting with the hem of her blouse. I even let the door hang open for a minute longer than necessary, just to feel the cool air wash away the residue of their presence. It wasn't grief I felt. It was the sharp echo of remembering how for years I had twisted myself into softer shapes just to be palatable. How I'd dulled my edges to keep the peace. How I'd sat through conversations that reduced me to footnotes and fables, always letting them speak the loudest. But something happens when you stop asking to be loved and start asking to be seen. You begin to resharpen. To reclaim the edges you'd once smoothed over. I used to think being soft made me good. That silence was virtue. That compromise was the price of love. Now I know better. Softness without safety is surrender. Silence in the face of dismissal is complicity. And compromise without reciprocity is just another form of erasure. That night, I walked the rooms of my house with bare feet, letting the cool wood floors remind me where I was and where I wasn't. I lit the candles on my mantel, not because I needed the light, but because I wanted it. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I danced. Alone. No music. Just the rhythm of breath and memory and defiance. I moved through the air like I owned it because I did. Every inch of that room belonged to me. Every inch of this life. And if echoes remained of their words, their doubts, their assumptions, I let them echo. Because this time, they had nowhere to land. There's a peculiar ache in realizing that the people who claim to know you best only ever knew the version of you that served them. They missed so much. They missed the night I stayed up until dawn learning how to refinish the cabinets with sandpaper and stolen time. They missed the day I made my first profit and used it not for celebration, but to fix the brakes on my neighbor's car because she couldn't afford the mechanic, and I remembered what it was like to have no one. They missed the moment I cried over the fireplace I built with my own hands, not out of sadness, but awe. That something could feel so much like home and be entirely mine. They missed the smaller things too, the way I started speaking up in meetings, the way I learned to say no without apology, the way I painted one wall a color no one would have approved of just because it made me feel bold. They missed the woman who began loving solitude not as a shield, but as a sanctuary. They missed my birthdays, of course. But more than that, they missed my becoming. And here's the truth no one tells you. The longer people fail to show up, the more they lose access to your becoming. It's not punishment. It's consequence. When you're no longer a witness, you lose the right to the inside view. So now, when they ask questions, they're always a beat behind. Always reaching for a reference that no longer fits. Trying to connect dots they weren't present to see drawn. I don't correct them. Let them believe whatever they need to sleep at night. I have peace. And not the performative kind they like to showcase at family dinners, the kind with folded napkins and false smiles. Mine is real. Mine is quiet. And most days, it's more than enough. There was a time when I practiced forgiveness like a performance. I would stand in front of the mirror, conjuring their faces in my mind. My mother's dismissive arch of brow, my father's patronizing sighs, my sister's curated concern, and I would say the words, "I forgive you," over and over like a chant. A mantra I hoped would hollow out the hurt, make the bitterness dissolve. As if repetition could exorcise betrayal. But the truth is, you can't rehearse forgiveness. It doesn't arrive on cue. It grows wild, unruly. Sometimes it doesn't grow at all. Back then, I believed forgiveness was expected of me. That being good meant letting go. That healing meant welcoming people back in. But time has taught me differently. Forgiveness is not synonymous with return. You can forgive someone and still never want to see them again. You can wish them peace and still bar the door. I've forgiven them in my own way. Not with a grand proclamation. Not with a tearful reunion. but in the quiet moments when I stopped waiting for the apology that never came. I forgave them when I stopped shrinking. I forgave them when I stopped justifying my joy. I forgave them the moment I chose peace over performance. And in that way, forgiveness became mine. Not a gift I gave them, but a key I turned in my own lock. A release. Not for them. For me. It was a Thursday when the first text came. Simple. Unassuming. Thinking of you. From my sister. It came without preamble, without context. As if 8 years of silence could be softened with 3 words. I stared at the message longer than I should have. Not because I didn't know how to respond, but because I didn't feel anything. Not joy. Not anger. Just quiet. She used to be the loudest presence in my life. Laughing over every story, interrupting my sentences, asking for help, and then forgetting she had. Now her voice was reduced to a tiny rectangle of text on a glowing screen. I didn't reply. Not to be cruel. But because not every knock deserves to be answered. The second message came 2 days later. You seemed different. Stronger. I mean that in a good way. It made me smile, but not in the way she probably intended. Of course I was different. Of course I was stronger. That was the entire point. The silence had shaped me. Not as a punishment, but as a crucible. I had learned to breathe inside it, to grow without their warmth, to light my own way when theirs went dim. So when it broke, when the messages started dripping through like cracks in an old dam, I didn't feel relief. I felt confirmation. They were beginning to understand that I hadn't been waiting. I had been building. And now the silence wasn't theirs to break. It was mine to protect. It was late afternoon when I saw the car pull into the driveway. A pale silver sedan, too clean for the gravel road, its wheels crunching with uncertain purpose. I knew before the knock who it would be. My sister. She stood there in a coat that looked too thin for the season, her fingers wrapped around a paper bag like it might grant her passage. Inside it, I'd later find cinnamon rolls. Still warm. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Her eyes searched my face like a map she used to know by heart. Mine stayed still. Not cold, just steady. I'd spent too long flinching at her shadows to give them room anymore. I was in the neighborhood, she said. She wasn't. We both knew that. But I didn't call her out on it. Can I come in? I thought about it. Not long. Just long enough to remind myself that this wasn't about politeness. It was about boundaries. Yes, I said. But not for long. She nodded, grateful but unsettled. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where they hadn't touched the pie. The same one where I'd once laid out blueprints for this house's renovation, fingers ink-stained, eyes burning with hope. She looked around like she was seeing it for the first time. This place is beautiful, she said. I mean it. Thank you. Silence stretched. Not as long or painful as before. Just wide. I brought these. She pushed the bag toward me. Your favorite, right? Still warm. They were. A half-smile tugged at her mouth, vanishing almost as quickly. She started to speak 3 different times before she settled on, "You've changed." I had to. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked quickly. I wasn't always kind, she said. No apology, but a beginning. You weren't always cruel either. That surprised her. Maybe she expected me to spit blame, but that would have meant I still needed her to carry it. I didn't. I missed you, she whispered. I missed who we used to be, I said, before it all got measured. She nodded slowly. Do you think we could get some of that back? I looked out the window. The lemon balm in the planter had wilted with the cold, but its roots were deep. Maybe, I said, but it won't look the same. And I won't shrink to make it happen. She nodded again, tears caught in her lashes. I wouldn't ask you to. For the first time in a very long time, I believed her to we split one of the roles. Quietly. No ceremony, no grand declarations. Just 2 sisters, hands wrapped around porcelain mugs, sharing something warm that wasn't blame. I tasted the cinnamon and brown sugar. It wasn't as sweet as I remembered, But it was enough. We didn't talk about the gathering. We didn't talk about the years that had stretched taut between us, or the silence that had once felt like punishment and then became preference. Instead, we talked about little things: her new apartment, my neighbor's troublesome cat, the lamp in my hallway that always flickered despite being rewired twice. It wasn't deep, but it was real. There's a kind of peace that comes from not picking the scab, from letting the wound breathe in stillness instead of dissecting it. I watched her carefully, not with suspicion, but with the kind of attention that comes from having been hurt before. I didn't owe her unguarded joy, but I could offer her honesty. She asked if I still painted. I said yes. She asked if I sold them. I said sometimes. She asked if she could see. I hesitated, but then I led her to the little studio off the den. The one with light-stained floors and canvases leaning against the walls like old secrets. She walked slowly, hands behind her back like we were in a museum. She didn't touch anything. She didn't offer praise too quickly. She just looked. And when she turned to me, her voice was quiet. "I didn't know you had this in you." That could have cut. It could have sounded like surprise, like doubt. But it didn't. Because she meant it. And I realized she had never been allowed to see this part of me. Maybe she'd never tried. Maybe I'd never trusted her to. But now here we were, in the stillness after the storm, breaking cinnamon rolls and old habits. Not forgiveness. Not quite yet. But a truce. There's a room in my house no one ever enters. Not because I keep it locked, but because it holds the parts of me that never needed witnesses. My journals live there, stacked in rows like soldiers who never stopped fighting. Their spines cracked, pages warped from the pressure of tears. Inside them live every version of me, frightened, furious, fractured, and fiercely growing. There's a photo too, not framed, just tucked between the pages of the oldest journal. It's from a time before the fracture. My sister and me, arms linked, eyes bright. Before the hierarchy hardened. Before I became an afterthought in my own home. I almost showed her that room. Almost. But then I remembered, some spaces are sacred not because they're hidden, but because they're healed. And healing doesn't always want an audience. She wouldn't have understood what it cost to build that room. The way I chose solitude when silence was used as a weapon. The way I filled it with light because no one else had offered any. The way I wrote my way back to myself one painful page at a time. She didn't need to see that. What mattered is that I no longer needed her to. So instead, I walked her back to the kitchen. She thanked me for the tea. For the time. For the stillness I had learned to hold like a gift. When she reached the door, she turned and said, "I don't expect you to trust me. I just wanted to begin." And I nodded, because beginnings are allowed, even after long winters, even when trust blooms slowly, like wildflowers through stone. The day after she left, I moved slowly through the house, not because anything had changed, but because something had shifted. The air felt different, less heavy. My shoulders no longer curled in defense. My breath came easier, not just in and out, but down, deep. The kind of breath you take when you realize you're no longer waiting for the knock to come. Her visit didn't break me. It didn't even bend me. And that, more than anything, felt like progress. I had once imagined her return 1,000 ways. Dramatic apologies. Tearful confessions. Maybe even anger. But I had never pictured what actually came, a quiet kind of reaching. A hand held out without demand. I didn't take it. Not fully, but I didn't slap it away either. Sometimes healing isn't the mending of broken things, it's the decision to let new things grow beside them. That night, I lit the candles again. All of them. The tall ones on the mantel. The small ones in jars I once painted during a lonely Christmas. The thick pillar on the bookshelf that smelled of lavender and something like childhood. I made a meal for one. Set the table for two. Not because I expected company, but because I liked the symbolism. One chair was for me, the woman I had become. The other? For possibility. Not hers. Mine. Because return isn't always about people. Sometimes it's about pieces of yourself you thought had disappeared. Hope, softness, curiosity, the desire to try again, not because someone asked you to, but because you want to. And I did. Not for her. For me. Some silences are passed down like heirlooms. In our family, they were carefully wrapped in politeness, stored in the attic of our behaviors, brought down only when it was too late to ask the hard questions. I used to think silence meant peace, that avoiding conflict was the same as choosing kindness. But the truth is, silence has many faces, and not all of them are gentle. There was the silence when my mother looked away as I cried in the kitchen at 13, shamed for something I hadn't done. The silence of my father's sighs when I spoke of art instead of law school. The silence at the dinner table when I tried to share a small win only to be drowned out by louder, more acceptable victories. And then there was the silence I adopted. The one where I stopped bringing myself to the table altogether. Inherited silences are dangerous, because they convince you that your voice is the problem. But I broke the chain. Not with shouting. Not with confrontation. But with clarity. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I just needed to speak without shrinking. When my sister left, I realized something deeper. She, too, had been taught silence. Not the same kind. Hers was the silence of complicity, of fitting in, of never questioning the script. She played her part so well, she forgot it was a role. Now maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to see it. And maybe, by watching me choose something different, she would too. Because silence is only power if it's chosen. And I had chosen voice. There's a garden behind the house, modest, uneven, stubborn. It wasn't part of the original plan. The soil was poor, the light spotty, the land sloped in a way that made everything harder than it should have been. But I planted anyway. Tomatoes that grew lopsided. Basil that flowered too early. Lavender that spread its roots into places I hadn't meant for it to go. Still, it bloomed. Not perfectly. Not predictably. But it bloomed. Much like me. I think that's why I kept it even when the weeds outpaced the roses, even when the deer nibbled at my greens, even when neighbors suggested I just pave it over. It reminded me that beauty doesn't have to ask permission. That resilience isn't always tidy. When my sister visited, she hadn't asked about the garden. She hadn't noticed the calluses on my palms or the dirt beneath my nails. She only saw the results, the neatly stacked stones, the splash of color near the back fence, the way it all seemed to come together. But gardens don't just come together. They're built. Over time. With sweat and failure and moments of nearly giving up. Just like lives. Just like mine. Sometimes I wonder if she saw it, the metaphor beneath the blossoms. If she knew the garden was a mirror of everything I'd built from broken things. But then I remind myself, it doesn't matter. I didn't grow it for her. I grew it for the girl I used to be, the one who kept planting, even when nothing seemed to take. She deserved this garden. And it grew. Anyway, it was my 24th birthday when I finally understood. I'd made a cake that year, chocolate with coffee icing, the way my grandmother used to make it before her memory slipped away. I lit a single candle. Not because I was feeling poetic, but because I had forgotten to buy more. I waited all day for a call that didn't come. The silence felt different that time. Not sharp, not bitter, just cold. Like stepping outside without a coat and realizing no one is coming to bring you one. My friends had plans. My coworkers were polite but distracted. And my family? They had simply forgotten. Later, I found out they'd gone out to dinner. All of them. A new restaurant in town. My mother raved about the risotto in a post I wasn't tagged in. I didn't cry. Not then. I just sat at the edge of my bed, fork in hand, eating the cake straight from the dish. And something inside me shifted. That was the day I stopped measuring my worth by their memory. By their invitations. By their convenience. I started making my own traditions after that. A morning walk on the riverbank. A bouquet bought just for me. A letter to myself, sealed and dated, reminding me of who I was becoming. It wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. If they couldn't remember me, I would. If they couldn't celebrate me, I would learn to find joy in my own name. And I have. Every year since, I light a single candle, not out of lack, but out of ritual. Not to wish. To honor. Her. Me. The one they forgot. The one I will never leave behind again. There's a room in my house I call the studio, but it's more than that. It's the room with no apologies. In there, I paint with colors too loud, write with pens that smudge, play music that doesn't match the moment. I leave brushes in water too long, let journals sprawl open across the floor like old loves not quite forgotten. And I never clean up until I'm ready. No one walks in uninvited. Not because I've forbidden it, but because the space knows who's earned its entry. And very few have. It's the only room I didn't show my sister. She lingered outside the doorway during her visit, fingers trailing along the wall, eyes curious. But she didn't ask. And I didn't offer. Not because I was hiding, but because I was protecting. That room holds every version of me I've ever been, the girl who doubted, the woman who rose, the artist who dared. And I will not explain her to those who once refused to see her. There is power in not needing to be understood. For so long, I chased clarity from people who only offered convenience. I shaped my words to fit their comfort, trimmed my truth until it no longer resembled mine. But not here. Not in this room. Here I am whole. Untranslated. Unapologetic. If they ever come back, and maybe they will, this room will still be mine. Unopened. Unyielding. Not a shrine to the past, but a sanctuary for the self I refuse to abandon. It was a morning like any other, tea steeping, the window cracked just enough to let the breeze tug gently at the curtain. I stood before the mirror in the hallway, the tall one with the chipped wooden frame I found at a flea market, and refinished myself. And I saw her. Not the girl I used to be. The one they crafted. The one they tolerated. I saw her, the woman who had emerged from the wreckage. And for once, I didn't flinch. There was strength in her eyes, not from struggle alone, but from choosing again and again to remain soft in a world that tried to make her hard. There was stillness in her stance, the kind that comes from no longer waiting for permission to exist. I used to avoid this mirror. It had seemed too much. The years of invisibility. The whispered mantras of maybe next time. The practiced smiles before family dinners, hoping this one would be different. But now I meet my own gaze. Not as a test. As a homecoming. There's a quiet echo in that reflection, not a haunting, but a hymn. A reminder that every scar is a story with an ending I survived. Sometimes I trace the edges of my collarbone, remember the nights I curled beneath wool blankets, asking the silence if I mattered. And now I answer back with hands that built a house, with feet that planted roots, with eyes that no longer look for approval but carry their own light. They used to say I was too sensitive, too quiet, too much and not enough. Let them. They never understood that softness was not weakness, it was resilience made visible. I don't need their mirrors anymore. I have my own. And in it, I see everything they missed. There are stories I carry that they will never know. Not because I've buried them, but because I no longer need to hand them over as proof. They didn't see me sleeping in my car for 2 nights after I left the city, too proud to ask for help, too afraid to be seen as lost. They weren't there the first time I spoke my price out loud in a room full of men who smirked at the idea of a woman leading the project and then paid me anyway. They didn't sit beside me as I held the hand of my neighbor's daughter, who cried not from pain, but from joy, because the little mural I painted on her bedroom wall looked exactly like her dreams. These stories aren't loud. They don't shout their importance. But they built me. Each one a stone in the path I carved alone. Each one proof that I didn't just survive, I lived. They wouldn't understand that my definition of success doesn't wear suits or drive shiny cars. It grows in shared meals, in evenings spent barefoot in my garden, in the quiet confidence of being exactly where I'm supposed to be. If I told them these stories, they might smile politely, might say, "Good for you." but they wouldn't feel them. Because they weren't there. And now, they don't need to be. These stories live in my walls, in the paint under my nails, in the laugh lines I've earned honestly. They don't need witnesses. Only remembering.